Hello everybody and welcome back to another bone-chilling Boyographic, where I take you through the highs and lows of the Game Boy library, one frightful Halloween-themed cart at a time. This week we're looking at a bit of an odd one. It's Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. The late 80s and early 90s were a weird time for licensed properties. Many R-rated movies put out toy lines in order to capitalise on the success of the movie that most parents would never dream of letting their children see. It became apparent that if you wanted to shift action figures on anywhere near a Star Wars level, you needed not only cool toys, but an animated series. Suddenly, a whole host of movies saw themselves becoming cartoons, including B-movies like The Toxic Avenger and, of course, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Naturally, these animated efforts bore very little resemblance to their source material and had relatively short stints on screen before their cancellation. But convinced that they were going to be the next big thing, these shows were not content with the idea of just toy sales, but wanted to dominate the full media landscape by also having video games. So, publishers signed deals and subcontracted smaller studios to produce games, often with incredibly tight timelines. Publishers like THQ, subcontracting studios like California-based Equilibrium. EQ, which is still based in Sausalito, was founded in 1989 around developing imaging software, and to their credit became a huge player in the field in 1992 with the release of their Debabilizer image editing software. But in the company's early days, they did make some games for the NES, SNES and Game Boy. The first of these games for THQ was Bo Jackson's Hit and Run, which was soon followed up by a contract for Attack of the Killer Tomatoes and The Flash respectively. However, EQ's gaming division wasn't large enough to handle the development of 3 Game Boy games in parallel, meaning delays in getting Bo Jackson through certification had a knock-on effect on the other 2 titles, as the company couldn't find anyone to begin programming them. Dan Filner, who had programmed the baseball half of Bo Jackson, found himself programming Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, and subsequently writing the engine that EQ's other Game Boy games would go on to utilise. I had the pleasure of talking to Dan about the game, in the hopes of shedding a little bit of light on its development. The game sees you playing as Wilbur Finleder, battling your way through hordes of killer tomatoes to stop the evil Dr. Gangrene and foil his plans to take over the world. This might seem like a bit of an odd choice to those familiar with the cartoon, as, well, I'd argue the main character is actually Chad, Wilbur's nephew, who, incidentally, you play as in the NES game, but we'll get back to his notable absence later. I guess they just chose Wilbur because he's a through line for the movies and the cartoon. As Wilbur, you'll fight the Red Menace in 11 stages across the city of San Zucchini. Beyond slaying tomatoes by swishing them into ketchup, your main goal is to find a can of tomatoes needed to progress to the next level before the time runs out. Along the way, you'll find pickups like swords Wilbur can throw, a whole host of points, multipliers, and status-affecting pickups. Of course, Wilbur's trusty parachute also makes an appearance too. All well and good, you might think. Who doesn't like a decent platformer? Well, then you start to play it. The first thing that'll strike you as odd is the controls. Unlike most games for the system, B is jump and A is used to attack. The horror! What's more is there's controls mapped to the start and select button also. Select sees Wilbur take up Chad's skateboard to move around the level faster, or open his parachute, while start is used to throw Wilbur's sword. Honestly, I got very little use out of the skateboard and parachute, and having the sword on the start button meant I didn't use it until halfway through the game when I tried to pause. When I asked Dan if there was any reason for this unconventional button layout, he simply put it down to the team not looking enough at other games and jamming things in at last minute. Such is life, I suppose. Other than the odd buttons, the platform itself is pretty enjoyable. Don't get me wrong, it takes a little while to get used to how high Wilbur can jump, but once you've got used to the physics, the platform itself handles relatively okay. At first, you'll get a good deal of pleasure in dispatching both the regular killer and hidden tomatoes around the level, squishing them and then collecting the cherry tomatoes that spawn from them in order to wrap up extra lives. As the levels go on and get more ambitious in their execution, however, that's where Attack of the Killer Tomatoes starts to wear. In order to raise the difficulty level, the game begins to introduce an influx of tomatoes attempting to stop Wilbur from reaching the good doctor. Some of these tomatoes will have cheap spawn placements, while others will follow seemingly random arches of attack at the player, ticking down your health. Sure, it can be replenished by collecting heroism tokens dotted around the level, but it often felt like right after I'd collected one, I'd end up getting hit for my troubles. Also, due to the, well, to be fair, well-animated enemies, the game also slows down as Wilbur jumps propel him towards them in some sections. The game's camera also feels pretty odd, as it allows the player to run fully to the right of the screen, forcing you to stop to allow the camera to scroll back into place so you can see the next set of obstacles. A feature that had me convinced that The Flash was the first game developed in the engine, as it felt like a deliberate decision to make Barry Allen feel fast. But alas, after checking with Dan, he told me Killer Tomatoes clearly came first, and had no recollection of whether this was an adjustment made specifically for The Flash or not. Throughout the game, you'll also encounter bosses based on Gangrene's tomato lieutenants, Beefsteak, Viper, and Sultan. These bosses actually end up forming a mini boss rush of sorts. After beating Beefsteak, the second boss is Beefsteak plus Viper, and the third and final boss sees you fighting all three at one time. While not the toughest bosses around, fighting all three of them in a row is actually a little bit harder than you might think, and pretty rewarding to beat. That said, I did die on the end boss and several times playing through the game, which sees the player met with a game over screen and the option to continue, which is also placed on odd buttons. You need to press select to continue, and pressing A or start will choose to return to the title screen. An odd choice, I know. Fortunately, I only made this mistake of returning to the title screen once towards the start of the game, and not at the end as well. I'd probably not have beaten it. As far as platformers on the Game Boy go, I'd say Killer Tomatoes is a pretty average game. It's not too difficult, and thanks to its unlimited continues, the game is beatable if you've got the patience to stick with it in spite of the odd button choices. The game looks nice, and even if the soundtrack isn't up to much, it's quite fun to play. Unlike most of its contemporaries, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes also has a relatively well-written story, delivered between stages by the show's news anchor Whitley White, and they did make me smile. However, it's worth noting that the game we got was not really the game EQ originally had in mind. Thanks to Mr. Filner, I got to see the design documents of the game that wanted Attack of the Killer Tomatoes to be the Super Mario Bros. 3 of the Game Boy in terms of quality. A password system, 2 player modes, and a whole host of ally characters were planned in the initial pitch of the game, like Tara and Chad, but unfortunately they never saw it into the final release. Who's to say if the studio hadn't had more time to develop the game, that Attack of the Killer Tomatoes wouldn't be up there with one of the better games on the system. But as I said right up top, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes was unfortunately rushed. A theme that will go on to dog development at EQ until the closure of its game division, as after the completion of Killer Tomatoes, Dan would find himself scrambling to program The Flash. That though, Game Boys and Girls, is a story for another time. There's not a lot more to say. Killer Tomatoes is a very run-of-the-mill platformer that has both its good and bad points. While it will take you some time to get used to the buttons and camera, the platforming and character animations are not bad at all. The difficulty curve is pretty fair in its ramp up to the final boss, and all in all, I enjoyed my experience with the game. I didn't love it, I wouldn't shake you by the shoulders and tell you how to go buy it yourself, but as the game got released in the US, Europe and Japan, if you come across it, why not give it a go? Of course, it didn't get released in massive quantities, as by the time the game reached shelves, the cartoon was off the air, meaning it is a bit of an obscurity, so please don't pay over the odds for what is undoubtedly a very watery tomato of a platformer. Enjoyable, yes, but lacking a little bit of flavour that could have made it a great game. And that brings us to the end of another spooktacular Boyographic, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed. A huge thank you to Dal Filner for helping me out with this one. Until next week though, Game Boys and Girls, where I'll be back with another spooky episode. Game on.